My husband got his mistress pregnant. I forgave my husband and secretly adopted the twins as our children, but then I found him sleeping with my sister in our bed. I kicked them both out of the house. I'm not sure how to begin or explain this, but something happened recently with my husband that has left me feeling hurt, embarrassed, and confused. It has been a heavy burden on my mind, and I haven't been able to talk to anyone about it yet. To give you some context, my husband, Kane, is 7 years older than me. We met when I was 21 and at a very low point in my life. My ex used to be abusive and manipulative, so when I met Kane after my breakup, I found him different, or so I thought. He was the perfect boyfriend for me and completely opposite of my ex. He planned all our dates, was a good listener, and knew what he wanted in life. He told me early on that he was looking to date someone he could eventually marry, as he was older than me. I wasn't sure if I should continue dating him since I wasn't sure about marriage, but as we continued to date, I slowly fell in love with him. Kane has no parents, having lost them in a car accident very early in his life. I believe this was a big reason why he always longed to have a family of his own. When we started getting serious, I introduced him to my family, and my parents absolutely adored him. Kane was charming and confident, and I could see that my dad liked him immediately. Even my older sister Jenny had no negative comments about him. I remember very clearly that Jenny commented on how Kane was a great catch. During that time, my sister was single, so I often invited her to join us when we went out. It was great, the three of us always had a lot of fun together, and I loved seeing them get along so well. There was never a hint of anything more than friendship between them. Eventually, my sister started dating her boyfriend, Fred, and we all continued to go out as couples. Although our boyfriends weren't exactly best friends, they got along well, and we enjoyed spending time together as a group. However, sometimes I noticed that Kane got very upset while talking to Fred. Fred was basically a happy-go-lucky guy who believed in crystals and astrology. There's nothing wrong with that, as he and my sister bonded over it, but Kane was vehemently against it. He would say things like my sister deserved better than a lunatic or that Fred was a weirdo. I tried to let it go, but once when the four of us went out to dinner, it wasn't a fancy place, and we usually took turns paying. It was Fred's turn, but he didn't have the money, so he asked my sister to pay, saying he would pay her back. Upon hearing this, Kane openly mocked him, saying how a real man never lets his lady pay and how he could take care of Jenny much better than he could. We all froze in shock, and I looked at him incredulously. Kane tried to retract his statement, saying he meant that she was like a sister to him since he was my boyfriend and could take care of her like family. I shook my head but kept quiet at that moment, not wanting to make things more uncomfortable for us publicly. Later, when I confronted him, he insisted that he had grown close to my family and cared about them like they were his own. He said Fred needed to do better, and I asked him to mind his own business, saying he had no right to speak to my sister's boyfriend like that and that I wouldn't let it slide a second time. Since then, Kane kept his mouth shut around Fred, who continued to have a good relationship with my parents throughout our dating phase. So it wasn't a surprise that when he proposed to me, I said yes. I had butterflies in my stomach and felt anxious about my decision, but I believed Kane was the one. We had a grand wedding, and I must say Kane left no stone unturned to give me the wedding of my dreams. My parents partially contributed to our wedding, but Kane bore the majority of the cost. All my friends and cousins were really envious of my wedding, telling me how lucky I was to have found an older man who had his life together. Throughout the wedding planning, my mom and Jenny were heavily involved in ensuring everything went as planned. We honeymooned in Hawaii, a place I had always wanted to visit. Kane and I had a wonderful time, and everything seemed to be going well for us. The problem only arose after we returned home. Kane was at work, and I worked from home as a graphic designer for a foreign company, so I had the advantage of working remotely from anywhere. There was a knock on my door, and I thought it might be the delivery man. I opened it to see a pregnant woman at my door. She said she was looking for Kane. I told her he wasn't home at the moment, but that I would be happy to take a message for her. She looked at me intensely, biting her lip nervously. I felt something was wrong, so I asked if she was okay. The woman started crying and asked if she could come in. I was a little apprehensive, but she seemed genuinely pregnant, and I didn't want to be cruel. I let her in and gave her a glass of water. Once she calmed down, she asked if I was married to Kane. I said yes, and she then told me she had no idea about this when she slept with Kane 4 months ago. My stomach dropped as I looked at her, and I could feel the ground beneath my feet shaking. She told me she was pregnant and didn't know what to do as she didn't want children. She explained how she wanted to have an abortion but couldn't bring herself to do it. So she tracked my husband through his LinkedIn page, followed him from his office to our home the previous evening but couldn't knock on our door because it was Saturday. Today, she assumed he would be home and came to confront him. Unfortunately for me, my husband was at work, so I was the one who opened the door. My heart felt like it had fallen into my stomach. I couldn't process what I had just heard. The man I was married to, the man I had supported through thick and thin, had betrayed me. I ran to the bathroom, trying to make sense of it all. How could someone I thought was sweet and kind do something so horrible? I had been nothing but supportive and loyal throughout our relationship. It felt like a punch to the gut. I started hyperventilating, and everything felt like a bad nightmare. The woman continued crying and begged me to calm down, and I felt bad for her and for myself for being in this situation. I called my husband and told him he needed to come home immediately. I don't know if it was the way my voice trembled, but he left work in the middle of the day to drive back home. When he walked into the house, his eyes fell on me sitting with the woman, and I saw the color drain from his face immediately. I knew then, without him even admitting it, that the woman was right. My husband had indeed cheated on me. The love of my life had gotten another woman pregnant. Tears streamed down my face as my husband knelt in front of me. He began to tell me that it was all a mistake and that he never intended to hurt me. I kept asking him why he would do this to me, and he told me it was just a one-night stand and it meant nothing. He then explained how 4 months ago, he was very stressed with the wedding planning and met her in a bar when he and his co-workers were drinking. She approached him, and he found her attractive. They hooked up in the bathroom, and that was it. To her credit, the woman agreed with him and told me how she thought she would never see him again until she found out she was pregnant. I shook my head and informed Cain that his one mistake was now going to cost us because she was pregnant with his child. At that moment, I wished I had never married him. My heart was in pieces. Cain closed his eyes as the woman informed him that she was pregnant with twins. He then asked her if she was sure they were his children, since she was a stranger to him. The woman agreed to a paternity test and told us she didn't want the babies or any child support. She had been thinking of giving the babies up for adoption but decided to inform him before doing so, as he had a right to know. She told us we could decide and let her know what we wanted and then left. The following days, Cain kept begging me not to leave him, telling me over and over how that woman meant nothing to him and that he wasn't in his right mind when it happened. There were so many justifications he offered, all of which boiled down to saying this would never happen again. I felt like I was walking through a fog during those days. I stayed curled up in bed for days because I didn't know what to do. I wanted to leave him, but at the same time, I felt like I would slip into a depression. Everything felt different and broken. I can still remember how devastated Cain looked when the woman told us she was going to give the babies up for adoption. The woman ended up having a prenatal paternity test, which confirmed they were his children. Until that moment, I had a little hope that maybe she was wrong, but the pain came back again when I saw the results. Cain sat me down and told me he had always wanted to be a father and that this should be a blessing for both of us. I glared at him as he continued to explain how we should think about adopting the woman's babies. Hearing this, I started screaming at him, asking if he had truly lost his mind. I told him there was no way he could suggest something so ridiculous to me, but Cain tried to calm me down, saying how we were always going to have kids in the future, so why not adopt the babies when we had the opportunity? He told me how God was giving me the perfect opportunity to not worry about getting pregnant in the future, since we would already have these children. When I still wasn't convinced, he began talking about how difficult his life was when his parents passed away and how hard it was to live in an orphanage. I knew this was a dark phase in his life, and he went through several foster homes, which scarred him even more. Cain broke down in tears and begged me to think about this with a calm mind and reconsider my decision. I asked him what we would tell my parents, as his infidelity was already embarrassing enough, and I couldn't let my family find out I was going to raise the children of his affair. Cain flinched at my words and told me he knew that woman meant nothing to him and that when it came to the kids, I didn't have to worry about anything since we could always say they were adopted. I started laughing and pointed out how that might be hard since the kids might start looking like him, but Cain told me we would cross that bridge when we got there. He assured me he would take care of me and the kids and that we would be one big happy family. Cain is a very persuasive talker, and over the next few days, I found myself considering his idea. It was true that the woman and Cain had no emotional connection, and she seemed like a nice person as she had been quite honest with me. She definitely had no intentions of keeping the babies, and it saddened me to think of the twins entering the system. If I didn't leave Cain and decided to stay with him, I didn't know if Cain could ever recover from that situation, knowing that his children were growing up in strangers' homes. If I decided to leave Cain, I would have to confess his infidelity, which would hurt my parents as much as it hurt me. Besides the infidelity, Cain was a good husband to me, and I didn't want our marriage to end so soon. I didn't know if I could completely forgive him, but I decided that if we were going to adopt the twins, we needed to do it legally. When I informed Cain about this, he was overjoyed. He assured me he would contact a lawyer and make sure we had all the proper documentation from the woman relinquishing her rights over the children and giving us full custody. Also, we needed to discuss how we could adopt them. I won't go into the details, but it was a long and exhausting process. Throughout all this, I never told my parents or Jenny anything, and no one knew a thing. The pregnant woman was more than helpful to us and had no issues signing all the papers we needed to adopt her babies. She was happy to leave her children with us, as she also felt bad about giving them up for adoption. When she went into labor, Cain and I were really stressed as her pregnancy was high risk, but thankfully, nothing went wrong, and she and the twins were fine. When I held the twins for the first time, I felt like all the hardships I had faced until that moment were worth it. I didn't even know I was crying with joy until the nurse pointed it out. We brought the babies home, and since then, I found another purpose for living my life. The hardest part at that moment was breaking the news to my family, who had no idea about any of this. My parents were shocked and came over to our house immediately. Cain and I stuck to our plan and informed them that we had applied for adoption and had been selected as the parents of the twins. My mom started crying as she looked at the babies, and my dad was in awe, hugging me, saying he couldn't believe his little girl now had babies. I got very emotional hearing that. The rest of the family, including Jenny, came to visit us and were all surprised by our decision but understood. No one doubted us, and I was glad as I didn't want to have to explain the truth to them. Besides, I had decided to let go of Cain's mistakes and just wanted to move forward with my babies. Trevor and Isaac are the best boys I could have asked for. They are adorable and everything one would expect from little boys. They have red hair like their mother, which is probably the reason why no one has suspected until now that they might be Cain's children. Cain is a devoted father to them, but the boys love me more than their dad as they are still kids. 4 years have passed since we brought them home. Throughout all this, many things have changed between Cain and me. We moved to a much bigger house to accommodate the 2 boys, and I have been promoted at my job, so I make quite a lot of money for the first time in my career. We went to couples therapy, and Cain has done everything possible to be patient and loyal to me. My sister Jenny and her boyfriend Fred got married 2 years ago. Their wedding was fun, and we all had a great time. However, 3 months ago, we found out that Fred was leaving Jenny, which was a huge shock as they had been together for a long time. Fred never revealed the reason to my parents, but since he and I had a good relationship, he told me how he had discovered that Jenny had been cheating on him with a coworker. This was a huge shock for me as I had no idea about it. I tried talking to Jenny about it, but she said she didn't want to talk, so I let it go to respect her space. Jenny had to move in with us as the house belonged to Fred's parents, who wanted her out immediately. Cain and I were more than welcoming to her. Jenny was also a good aunt to our boys, so I was glad she could live with us until she was ready to stand on her own again. Cain was always kind to my sister, as much as he was to me. If he bought me flowers, he would also buy flowers for her. If he bought me an expensive gift, he would buy her a cheaper piece of jewelry. It hurt me, but my husband and I were quite well off financially, so I let it slide. Besides, Jenny deserved to be pampered a little since she had been feeling lonely after her divorce. However, I started noticing more and more how close they were becoming. Jenny would always touch his arms or laugh a bit too hard at his jokes. She would also comment on how sexy she found it that my husband took care of the kids. It bothered me. Last week, when Cain and I were sleeping, his phone vibrated because he received a message. Cain always has the bad habit of leaving his phone under the pillow, which means that every time his phone vibrates, I feel it too. Call it women's intuition, but I felt something was definitely wrong. Cain was snoring, so I silently took his phone and went to the bathroom. I knew his password, so I unlocked it to see that an unknown number had texted him saying, "I miss you." My heart sank, and it felt like all my past fears came rushing back to my mind. It felt like déjà vu, and I immediately woke him up. He woke up groggily, asking me what had happened when I shoved the phone in his face and asked him to explain. He looked at the phone for a second and told me he had no idea who it was. He pointed out that this message could have been sent by mistake as this number wasn't even saved in his phone. He calmed me down as I paced the room, saying I was overthinking. He assured me he would never do something like that and had learned from his mistakes the first time. I felt a bit calm as his explanation made sense, and there were no other messages exchanged between him and that number. I almost forgot about it until yesterday when I came into my house. I had gone out to get groceries, but it was raining, so the store was closed. The twins were watching TV with the volume very high, which was almost deafening. I was about to turn the volume down when I heard moaning from upstairs. I looked around and couldn't find my husband or Jenny. I went upstairs and realized the sound was coming from our bedroom. I burst open the door to see Jenny doing the unthinkable with my husband. A small gasp escaped my mouth as I fell to the floor in shock. Kane noticed me and went pale as a sheet. He immediately pushed Jenny away and looked like he had seen a ghost. Jenny, on the other hand, seemed unfazed as she quickly dressed. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My own sister, my best friend, had betrayed me. The pain and anger coursed through me like a massive wave. It felt like my world was falling apart around me. How could they do this to me? How long had this been going on behind my back? I wanted to scream and lash out at them, but I was paralyzed by the shock and betrayal. Before I could even process what was happening, Jenny spoke in a voice dripping with arrogance. "It looks like you caught us, sis," as she said mockingly. "I guess you're not as smart as you thought." I started screaming insults at her, telling her how dare she come into my house and sleep with my husband with my children downstairs. Jenny seemed unfazed and responded that she had done nothing wrong since she and Kane were in love with each other. Kane immediately started shaking his head and denying this, but Jenny continued, saying it was.